I thought it was crucial.
When I was a young Thomas.
When I was a young Thomas. Whenever you say that, that's just what tradition says. You just gotta say that.
I first found Lord of the Rings in the dusty back end of my library, and nobody was reading it back then. It was way before it became culturally powerful. Way before Peter Jackson movies, way before the old animated cartoon. And I picked up the first book, Fellowship of the Ring, and I read like 2 pages. I went, that's boring. And then I went to Two Towers, which was the next book on the shelf, and I picked that up, and it starts with the death of Boromir. I thought, this is cool. And I read the whole thing, and I said, what is going on? And so I went back, and I got Fellowship and started over. That's my original dusty back of the library story. Now, I have this big fancy copy that I finally bought myself, a good version of The Lord of the Rings. It seems like my camera is flipped. Maybe I'll turn it that way. Nope. Alrighty. Let's see how much reading we get done in an evening with the Steffens. All kinds of translation history notes. First edition, second edition.
The Fellowship of the Ring in a nutshell. So those tiny little moments made funny.
The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. 50th Anniversary Edition. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. Prologue concerning hobbits. That's forever going to be in the recording. This book is largely concerned with hobbits, and from its pages a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Further information will also be found in the selection from the Red Book of Westmarch that has already been published under the title The Hobbit. That story was derived from the earlier chapters of the Red Book, composed by Bilbo himself, the first Hobbit to become famous in the world at large, and called by him There and Back Again, since they told of his journey into the East and his return. An adventure which later involved all the hobbits in the great events of that age that are here related. Many, however, may wish to know more about this remarkable people from the outset, while some may not possess the earlier book. For such readers, a few notes on the more important points are here collected from Hobbit lore, and the first adventure is briefly recalled. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, for they love peace and quiet and good tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a water mill, or a hand loom, though they are skillful, or were skillful, with tools. Even in ancient days, they were, as a rule, shy of the big folk, as they call us. Now they avoid us with dismay, and are becoming hard to find. They are quick of hearing and sharp-eyed, and though they are inclined to be fat, and do not hurry unnecessarily, they are nonetheless nimble and deft in their movements. They possessed, from the first, the art of disappearing swiftly and silently when large folk, whom they do not wish to meet, come blundering by. And this art they have developed, until to men it may seem magical. But hobbits have never, in fact, studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to a professional skill that heredity and practice and close friendship with the earth have rendered inimitable by bigger, clumsier races. For they are a little people, smaller than dwarves, less stout, less stocky, that is, even when they are not actually much shorter. Their height is variable, ranging between 2 and 4 feet of our measure. They seldom now reach 3 feet. but they have dwindled, they say, and in ancient days they were taller. According to the Red Book, Banderbus took Bulroar, the son of Izumbras III, was 4'5" and able to ride a horse. He was surpassed in all Hobbit records only by two famous characters of old, but that curious matter is dealt with in this book. As for the Hobbits of the Shire, with whom these tales are concerned, in the days of their peace and prosperity, they were a merry folk. They dressed in bright colors, being notably fond of yellow and green, but they seldom wore shoes, since their feet had tough leathery soles and were clad in thick curling hair, much like the hair on their heads, which was commonly brown. Thus, the only craft little practiced amongst them was shoemaking. But they had long, skillful fingers, and they could make many other useful and comely things. Their faces were, as a rule, good-natured rather than beautiful, broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked, with mouths apt to laughter, and to eating, and to drinking. And laugh they did, and eat, and drink, often and heartily, being fond of simple jests at all times, and of 6 meals a day when they could get them. They were hospitable, and delighted in parties and in presents, which they gave away freely and eagerly accepted. It is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves or even than dwarves. Of old, they spoke the languages of men, after their own fashion, and liked and disliked much the same things that men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom, and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear that hobbits had, in fact, lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk became even aware of them. And the world, being after all full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed of very little importance. But in the days of Bilbo and of Frodo, his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the councils of the wise and great. Those days, the third age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shapes of all lands have been changed. But the regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, the northwest of the Old World, east of the sea. Of their original home, the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. A love of learning, other than genealogical lore, was far from general among them. But there remained still a few of the older families who studied their own books and even gathered reports of old times and distant lands from elves and dwarves and men. Their own records began shortly after the settlement of the Shire, and their most ancient legends hardly looked further back than their wandering days. It is clear, nonetheless, from these legends and from the evidence of their peculiar words and customs that, like many other folk, hobbits had, in the distant past, moved westward. Their earliest tales seem to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper valley of the Anduin, between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains. Why they later undertook the hard, perilous crossing of the mountains into Eriador is no longer certain. Their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the land, and of a shadow that fell on the forest, so that it became darkened, and its new name was Mirkwood. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into 3 somewhat different breeds: Harfoots, Stoors, and Fallowhides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter. They were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred the highlands and the hillsides. The Stoors were broader, heavier of build. Their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred flatlands and riversides. The Fallowhides were fairer of skin and also of hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the others. They were lovers of trees and of woodlands. The Harfoots had much to do with dwarves in ancient times, and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westward early. They roamed over Eriador as far as Weathertop, while the others were still in the wilder land. They were the most normal and representative variety of hobbit, and by far the most numerous. They were the most inclined to settle in one place, and longest preserved their ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. The Stores lingered long by the banks of the great river Anduin, and were less shy of men. They came west after the Harfoots, and followed the course of the Loudwater southward. And there many of them long dwelt between Tharbad and the border of Dunland, before they moved north again. The Fallowhides, the least numerous, were a northerly branch. They were more friendly with the elves than the other hobbits were, and they had more skill in language and song than in handicrafts, and of old they preferred hunting to tilling. They crossed the mountains north of Rivendell and came down to the river Horwell. In Eriador they soon mingled with the other kinds which had preceded them, but being somewhat bolder and more adventurous, they were often found to become leaders or chieftains amongst the clans of Harfoots and Stores. Even in Bilbo's time, the strong Fallowhidish strain could be noted among the greater families, such as the Tooks and the Masters of Buckland. In the westlands of Eriador, between the Misty Mountains and the Mountains of Lune, the hobbits found both men and elves. Indeed, a remnant still dwelt there of the Dunedain, the kings of men who had come over the sea out of Westernese, but they were dwindling fast, and the lands of the northern kingdom were falling far and wide into waste. There was room, and to spare, for incomers, and ere long the hobbits began to settle in ordered communities. Most of their earlier settlements had long disappeared and been forgotten in Bilbo's time, but one of the first to become important still endured, though reduced in size. This was at Bree, and in the Chatwood that lay round about some 40 miles east of the Shire. It was in these early days, doubtless, that the hobbits learned their letters and began to write after the manner of the Dunedain, who had, in their turn, long before, learned the art from the elves. And in those days, also, they forgot whatever languages they had used before, and spoke ever after the common speech, the Westron, as it was named, that was current through all the lands of the kings of Arnor and of Gondor, and about all the coasts of the sea, from Belfast to Lune. Yet they kept a few words of their own, as well as their own names, of months and days, and of great store of personal names out of the past. About this time, legend among the hobbits first becomes history, with a reckoning of years. For it was in the 1601st year of the Third Age that the Fallowhide brothers, Marcho and Blanco, set out from Bree, and having obtained permission from the High King at Fornost, they crossed the brown river Barandween with a great following of hobbits. They passed over the bridge of Stonebow, and that had been built in the days of the power of the northern kingdom, and they took all the land beyond to dwell in, between the river and the far downs. All that was demanded of them was that they should keep the great bridge in repair, and all other bridges and roads, and speed the king's messengers, and acknowledge his lordship. Thus began Shire reckoning. For the year of the crossing of the Brandywine, as the hobbits turned the name, became year 1 of the Shire, and all later dates were reckoned from it. At once the western hobbits fell in love with their new land, and they remained there and soon passed once more out of the history of men and of elves. While there was still a king, they were in name his subjects, but they were in fact ruled by their own chieftains, and meddled not at all with the events of the world outside. To the last battle at Fornost with the Witch Lord of Angmar, they sent some bowmen to the aid of the king, or so they maintained, though no tales of men record it. But in that war the northern kingdom ended, and then the hobbits took the land for their own. And they chose from their own chiefs a thane to rule and hold the authority of the king who was gone. There, for 1,000 years, they were little troubled by wars, and they prospered and they multiplied after the dark plague in Shire Reckoning 37, until the disaster of the long winter and the famine that followed it. Many thousands then perished, but the days of dearth, from 1158 to 60, were at that time of this tale long past, and the hobbits had again become accustomed to plenty. The land was rich and kindly, and though it had been deserted when they entered it, it had before been well tilled, and there the king had once had many farms and cornlands and vineyards and woods. 40 leagues it stretched from the far downs to the Brandywine Bridge, and 50 from the northern moor to the marshes in the south. The hobbits named it the Shire, as the region of the authority of their thane, and a district of well-ordered business. And there, in that pleasant corner of the world, they plied their well-ordered business of living, and they heeded less and less the world outside, where dark things moved, until they came to think that peace and plenty were the rule in Middle-earth, and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored that they had ever known of the guardians, or of the labors of those that made possible the long peace of the Shire. They were, in fact, sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. At no time had hobbits of any kind been warlike, and they had never fought among themselves. In olden days, they had, of course, been often obliged to fight to maintain themselves in a hard world, but in Bilbo's time, that was very ancient history. The last battle before this story opens, indeed the only one that had ever been fought within the borders of the Shire, was beyond living memory, the Battle of Green Fields in the Shire Reckoning in 1147, in which Banderbus took routed an invasion of orcs. Even the weathers had grown milder, and the wolves that had once come ravening out of the north in bitter white winters were now only a grandfather's tale. So, though there was still some store of weapons in the Shire, these were used mostly as trophies, hanging above hearths or on walls, or gathered into a museum at Michael Delving, and Matham House it was called, for anything that hobbits had no immediate use for, but were unwilling to throw away, they called a Matham. Their dwellings were apt to become rather crowded with Mathams, and many of the presents that passed from hand to hand were of that sort. Nonetheless, ease and peace had left this people still curiously tough. They were, if it came to it, difficult to daunt or to kill. And they were, perhaps, so unwearyingly fond of good things, not least because they could, but, when put to it, do without them, and could survive rough handling by grief, foe, or weather in a way that astonished those who did not know them well, and looked no further than their bellies and their well-fed faces. Though slow to quarrel, and for sport killing nothing that lived, they were doughty at bay. And as need, they could still handle arms. They shot well with the bow, for they were keen-eyed and sure of the mark, not only with bows and arrows. If any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quickly under cover, for all trespassing beasts knew very well. All hobbits had originally lived in holes in the ground, or so they believed, and in such dwellings they still felt most at home. But in the course of time they had been obliged to adopt other forms of abode. Actually, in the Shire in Bilbo's days, it was, as a rule, only the richest and the poorest hobbits that maintained the old custom. The poorest went on living in burrows of the most primitive kind, mere holes indeed, with only one window or none, while the well-to-do still constructed more luxurious versions of the simple diggings of old. But suitable sites for these large ramifying tunnels, or smiles as they called them, were not everywhere to be found, and in the flats and the low-lying districts the hobbits, as they multiplied, began to build above ground. Indeed, even in the hilly regions and the older villages such as Hobbiton and Tuckborough, or in the chief township of the Shire, Michael Delving, or the White Downs, there were now many houses of wood and brick and stone, These were specially favored by millers, smiths, ropers, and cartwrights, and others of that sort. For even when they had holes to live in, hobbits had long been accustomed to build sheds and workshops. The habit of building farmhouses and barns was said to have begun amongst the inhabitants of the Marish down by the Brandywine. The hobbits of that quarter, the East Farthing, were rather large and heavy-legged, and they wore dwarf boots in muddy weather, but they were well known to be stores in a large part of their blood, and indeed was shown by the down that many of them grew on their chins. No Harfoot or Fallowhide had any trace of a beard. Indeed, the folk of the Marish and of Buckland east of the river, which they afterwards occupied, came for the most part later into the Shire from the southern ways, and they still had many peculiar names and strange words that were not found elsewhere in the Shire. It is probable that the craft of building, as many other crafts beside, was derived from the Dunedain, but the hobbits may have learned it directly from the elves, the teachers of men in their youth. For the elves of the High Kindred had not yet forsaken Middle-earth, and they dwelt still at that time, at the Grey Havens away to the west, and in other places within reach of the Shire. 3 elf towers of immemorial age were still to be seen on the Tower Hills beyond the immemorial age. 3 elf towers of immemorial age were still to be seen on the Tower Hills beyond the western marches. They shone far off in the moonlight. The tallest was furthest away, standing alone on a green mound. The hobbits of the West Farthing said that one could see the sea from the top of that tower, but no hobbit had ever been known to climb it. Indeed, few hobbits had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and fewer still had ever returned to report it. Most hobbits regarded even rivers and small boats with deep misgivings. Not many of them could swim. And as the days of the Shire lengthened, they spoke less and less with the elves, and grew afraid of them, and distrustful of those that had dealings with them. And the sea became a word of fear among them, a token of death, and they turned their faces away from the hills in the west.
So the token of death is what exactly?
Something they thought would kill them.
Okay.
The craft of building may have come from elves or men, but the hobbits used it in their own fashion. They did not go in for towers. Their houses were usually long, low, and comfortable. The oldest kind were indeed no more than built imitations of smiles, thatched with dry grass or straw, roofed with turves, having walls somewhat bulging. That stage, however, belonged to the early days of the Shire, and hobbit building had long since been altered, improved by devices, and learned from the dwarves or discovered by themselves. A preference for round windows and even round doors was a chief remaining peculiarity of hobbit architecture. The houses and the holes of Shire hobbits were often large and inhabited by large families. Bilbo and Frodo Baggins were, as bachelors, very exceptional, as they also were in many other ways, such as their friendship with elves. Sometimes, as in the case of the Tooks of the Great Smiles or the Brandybucks at Brandy Hall, many generations of relatives lived in comparative peace together in one ancestral, many-tunneled mansion. All hobbits were, in any case, clannish, and reckoned up their relationships with great care. They drew long, elaborate family trees with innumerable branches. In dealing with hobbits, it is important to remember who is related to whom, and in what degree. It would be impossible in this book to set out a family tree that included even the more important members of the more important families at the time which these tales tell of. The genealogical trees at the end of the Red Book of Westermarch are a small book in themselves, and all but hobbits find them exceedingly dull. Hobbits delighted in such things, if they were accurate. They liked to have books filled with things that they already knew, set out in fair and square, with no contradictions.
I forgot what no prologue before.
What?
How long is the prologue?
There's a reason Dad put it down the first time.
There's a reason what?
Dad put it down the first time.
The birds are already in bed, Mom.
Concerning pipeweed. There is another astonishing thing about hobbits of old that must be mentioned, an astonishing habit. They imbibed, or inhaled, through pipes of clay or wood, the smoke of the burning leaves of a herb, which they called pipeweed, or leaf, a variety probably of nicotiana. A great deal of mystery surrounds the origin of this particular custom, or art, as the hobbits preferred to call it. All that could be discovered about it in antiquity was put together by Meriadoc Brandybuck, later Master of Buckland, and since he and the tobacco of the South Farthing play a part in the history that follows, his remarks in the introduction to Herb Lore of the Shire may be quoted. This, he says, is the one art that we can certainly claim to be our own invention. When hobbits first began to smoke is not known. All the legends and the family histories take it for granted. For ages, folk of the Shire smoked various herbs, some foul, some sweet, but all accounts agree. Tolbald Hornblower of Longbottom in the South Farthing first grew true pipeweed in his gardens in the days of Isengrim II, about the year 1070 Shire reckoning. The best homegrown still comes from that district, especially the varieties now known as Long Bottom Leaf and Old Toby and Southern Star. How old Toby came by the plant is not recorded, for to his dying day he would not tell. He knew much about herbs, but he was no traveller. It is said that in his youth he went often to Bree, though he certainly never went further from the Shire than that. But it is thus quite possible that he learned of this plant in Bree, where now, at any rate, it grows well on the south slopes of the hill. The Bree hobbits claim to have been the first actual smokers of pipeweed. They claim, of course, to have done everything before the people of the Shire, whom they refer to as colonists. But in this case, their claim is, I think, likely to be true. And certainly it was from Bree that the art of smoking the genuine weed spread into the recent centuries amongst the dwarves and such other folk, rangers and wizards and wanderers, as still pass to and fro through that ancient road meeting. The home and centre of the art is thus to be found in an old inn in Bree, the Prancing Pony, that has been kept by the family of Butterbur from time beyond record. All this same observations that I have made known on my many journeys south have convinced me that the weed itself is not native to our part of the world, but came northward from the Lower Anduin, whither it was, I suspect, originally brought over the sea by the men of Westernese. It grows abundantly in Gondor, and there is a richer and larger than in the north, where it is never found wild, and flourishes only in warm, sheltered places like Longbottom. The men of Gondor call it sweet gallinass, and esteem it for the fragrance of its flowers. From that land it must have been carried up the Greenway during the long centuries between the coming of Elendil and our own days. But even the Dúnedain of Gondor allow us this credit. Hobbits first put it in pipes. Not even the wizards thought of that before we did, though one wizard that I knew took up the art long ago and became as skillful in it as in all other things that he put his mind to. Section 3, the ordering of the Shire.
Your reading is excellent.
The Shire was divided into 4 quarters, the farthings already referred to, north, south, east, and west, and these again each into a number of folklands, which also bore the names of some of the old leading families, although by the time of this history, these names were no longer found only in the proper folklands. Nearly all Tooks still lived in Tookland, but that was not true of many other families, such as the Bagginses or the Boffins. Outside the farthings were the east and west marches, the Buckland, and the Western March, added to the Shire in Shire reckoning 1462. The Shire at that time had hardly any government. Families, for the most part, would manage their own affairs. Growing food and eating it occupied most of their time. In other matters, they were, as a rule, generous, but not greedy, but contented and moderate, so that estates, farms, workshops, and small trades tended to remain unchanged for generations. There remained, of course, the ancient tradition concerning the High King at Fornost, or Norbury as they called it, away north of the Shire. But there had been no king for nearly 1,000 years, and even the ruins of King's Norbury were covered with grass. Yet the hobbits still said of wild folk and wicked things, such as trolls, that they had not heard of the king, for they attributed to the king of old all of their essential laws, and usually they kept their laws of free will, because they were the rules, as they said, both ancient and just. It is true that the Took family had long been preeminent, for the office of Thane had passed to them from the Old Bucks some centuries before, and the chief Took had borne the title ever since. The Thane was the master of the Shire Moot, and the captain of the Shire Muster, the Hobbitry in arms. But as muster and moot were only held in times of emergency, which no longer occurred, the thaneship had ceased to be more than a nominal dignity. The Took family was still indeed accorded to special respect, for it remained both numerous and exceedingly wealthy, and was liable to produce in every generation some strong characters of peculiar habits and even adventurous temperaments. These latter qualities, however, were now rather tolerated in the rich than generally approved. The custom endured nonetheless of referring to the head of the family as the Took, and of adding to the name, if required, a number, such as Isengrim II, for instance. The only real official in the Shire at this date was the Mayor of Michael Delving, or of the Shire, who was elected every 7 years at the free fair on the White Downs at the Lythe, that is, in midsummer. As mayor, almost his only duty was to preside at banquets given during the Shire holidays, which occurred at frequent intervals. But the offices of postmaster and first sheriff were attached to the mayor's office. I don't know that word. Mayoralty. So that he managed both the messenger service and the watch. These were the only Shire services, and the messengers were the most numerous, and the much busier of the two. By no means all hobbits were lettered, but those who were wrote constantly to all their friends, and a selection of their relations, who lived further off than an afternoon's walk. The sheriffs was the name that the hobbits gave to their police, or the nearest equivalent that they possessed. They had, of course, no uniforms, such things being quite unknown, only a feather in their cap. And they were in practice rather haywards than policemen, more concerned with the straying of beasts than of people. There were, in all the Shire, only 12 of them, 3 in each farthing, for inside work, and a rather large body, varying at need, was employed to beat the bounds and to see to